please use the private network when you can. It's faster, it's cheaper, and it's more secure. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, right now I'm on the Railway dashboard and I have an app that's deployed. This is a full stack app. So I have both my front end and API in the same project, and I have a Postgres database. Now, this arrow right here is because this service is referencing variables from this other service, in which case it's my database. Now, when I want to connect to a service on Railway, there's actually two ways to do it. So if I click on this service, my app, go to settings, go to networking, you see that the first option is public networking. So this is what allows me to access my app over HTTP. There will be a domain, and it's going to be just publicly accessible over the internet. But the other option is private networking, and you use this when you want multiple services in your Railway project to communicate with each other. And you should absolutely use this by default when you can, just because, one, it's faster because traffic doesn't go through the public internet and just all the services are co-located and are able to communicate with each other. But most importantly, it's free. You don't incur any egress or data transfer costs when you use the private network. So for example, if I have like my API that's deployed and I have maybe some sort of background worker or like a cron server, since this is like a purely a service that is only needed by the backend and it doesn't need to be publicly accessible over the internet, then there's just no need for you to assign it a domain and connect over HTTP, and you should just use the private network. Now, another example, which is more common, and it's actually connecting to your database. So on Railway, when you deploy a Postgres database, you actually have access to two connection strings you could use. So for my Postgres database, when I click on it, go to variables, you see here that we have actually the database public URL, and you even have like a tiny warning sign. And here is just saying that connecting to a public endpoint will incur egress fees. So just use the private URL because you're not going to expose your database over like the public internet anyway. And you can, but what I'm saying is like you're not going to query it directly from the front end. Now, there are some tools that allow you to do that, but it's not, focus on them. Let's say typically you'll only query your database server side. So yeah, in this case, you shouldn't use the database public URL. You should just use the database URL. Now, there are cases where you will need to use the public URL. Let's say you're using some sort of database GUI and it's not running on Railway and it needs to connect to your database. So in this case, if you're using something like Table Plus, then that's fine for you to use the public URL. But your default should be the database URL, which uses a private network. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I built a demo that essentially compares the difference when using the private URL versus the public URL. It's called use the private network.up.railway.app. I'll leave a link to it. You can try it. But essentially, it runs a latency test. And the test is pretty simple. I have two API endpoints. One API endpoint uses the private database URL. The other uses the public database URL. And then we're just comparing speeds. Now, both my app and my database, this is actually this project, are deployed in US East. And right now I'm querying it and I'm like somewhere, closer to Europe. So that's why it's not going to be like the fastest results. Technically, you could have like replicas deployed in other regions, but the database will be in one region. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it. But now essentially I'm running like 10 queries. They're all like select one. And even though this is like a super simple query, like hopefully you're not just running select ones in production, you can even still see a massive difference in performance for the server to database step, right? Because essentially the way this works is I run the test, there's client, API database, and then database to the API, and then API to the client. And essentially we're just measuring this entire like round trip. And it's broken down into these two stages. So one is like the server to the database, and then just the total request and how long it took. So for the private network, you'll see here that on average, it's like, at least when I ran this test, it's like 61% faster. And this is for like a select one. So like the numbers really add up. The more you just have more queries, the more you scale. And especially if you're transferring a lot of data, when using the private network, well, you're not going to be paying as much, right? Because if you're using the public URL, what will happen is there's going to be data transfer between your service and the database, and then between the database and the client. So like just use the private network. It's cheaper. And yeah, you could try out this demo. It's actually built using TestX Start. Super excited about this framework. We'll talk more about it in future videos. But yeah, that's it for today's video. TLDR, use the private network when you can. And yeah, that's it for today. And I'll see you in the next one.